Ruth's hands trembled as she opened the lockbox hidden beneath 60 years of marriage certificates and birthday cards. Inside, a woman's handwriting spelled out everything she thought she knew about love and proved it was all a lie. The discovery happened on a Tuesday afternoon in her Cleveland suburb, the kind of gray October day where the light filters through bare oak branches and makes everything feel both ordinary and final. Ruth had been sorting through Gerald's belongings for 3 months since the funeral, moving through their split-level home with the methodical numbness of a widow who waters plants and answers condolence calls, but hasn't really felt anything since the cemetery. She wore his old Ohio State sweatshirt while she worked, breathing in the fading scent of his Old Spice cologne, and kept NPR playing low in the background because silence had become unbearable. The lockbox sat in the back of his home office closet behind old tax returns and a broken humidifier. She'd almost missed it. The key was taped underneath his desk drawer, and she only found it because she was measuring the desk for donation to Goodwill. What she found inside would rewrite 43 years of shared breakfasts, family road trips to Niagara Falls, and the quiet partnership she'd believed was the bedrock of her existence. But it wasn't the affair itself that shattered her. It was the evidence of its careful architecture, the systematic deception that had existed parallel to their life, like a shadow she'd somehow never noticed. The letters were bundled with rubber bands, organized by year, 1979 through 2022. Ruth sat on the closet floor, Gerald's sweatshirt sleeve pulled over her hand, and read them in chronological order as afternoon shadows lengthened across the carpet. They weren't love letters exactly. They were something more insidious. Status updates, logistical planning, a woman named Diane writing about their weekends in Cincinnati hotels while Ruth thought Gerald was attending insurance conferences. Diane mentioning the earrings he bought her the same month he told her their budget was too tight for the kitchen renovation she wanted. Ruth was 76 years old. She'd raised 3 children in this house, hosted countless Thanksgiving dinners with her mother's good china, volunteered at the elementary school library for 20 years, and pruned the rose bushes Gerald planted for their 10th anniversary. She'd believed in the narrative of their marriage the way she believed in gravity, as an immutable fact requiring no examination. The evidence now spread across her lap suggested she'd been living in a story only she believed. Her first instinct was violent in its intensity. Not physically violent, Ruth hadn't been that kind of person, but emotionally savage. She wanted to find Diane, whoever she was, and deliver these letters to her doorstep with a note explaining exactly what they'd cost. She wanted to call her children and reveal their father's duplicity, to shatter the idealized memory they'd constructed at his funeral, where they spoke of his integrity and devotion. She wanted to scream in a way she'd never allowed herself to scream in 76 years of being polite, accommodating, and good. Instead, she made chamomile tea and sat at her kitchen table as streetlights flickered across the neighborhood. The house settled around her with its familiar creaks. Through the window, she could see the Johnsons walking their golden retriever, the same evening ritual they'd maintained for years. Everything looked exactly as it had that morning, but the architecture of her interior world had collapsed. Ruth didn't sleep that night. She sat in Gerald's recliner, her recliner now, she supposed, and let rage move through her in waves. She thought about all the times she'd sensed something off, dismissed her own intuition as paranoia or insecurity. The weekend in 1987 when he'd been distant after a conference and she'd blamed herself for not being interesting enough. The Christmas in the 90s when he seemed distracted during gift opening and she'd worked harder to make everything festive. How many moments had she gaslit her own perceptions to preserve a fiction? By dawn, Ruth had moved from rage into something colder and more clarifying. She pulled out her old stationery, the cream-colored paper with small violets in the corner that she used for thank-you notes, and began writing. Dear Diane. The letter started with measured fury. Ruth detailed exactly what Diane had participated in: the family dinners missed while Gerald was with her, the anniversaries half celebrated because he was emotionally elsewhere. She wrote about the kidney stones she had in 2006 when Gerald said he couldn't leave his conference early and Ruth's sister had driven her to the ER instead. She wrote about their granddaughter's birth when Gerald arrived late to the hospital and Ruth had made excuses for him to her daughter. She filled 12 pages. Her handwriting grew increasingly jagged as decades of swallowed disappointment found words. But when she reached for an envelope, something stopped her. What would sending this accomplish? Diane probably had her own story, her own rationalizations. Maybe she'd even believe Gerald's version of events, whatever version that was. Ruth set the letter aside and pulled out fresh paper. This time, she wrote something different. Dear Ruth, you're 23 years old. You're standing in your parents' living room in Akron, wearing the white dress your mother sewed, about to marry a man who makes you laugh and promises you stability. You believe love is enough. You believe partnership means subordinating your needs to the relationship's needs. You believe if you're kind enough, patient enough, small enough in your demands, everything will work out. I'm writing from 53 years in your future to tell you something nobody told us then. Your life is not a supporting role in someone else's story. The words came easier than the rage had. Ruth wrote through that entire morning, pausing only to refill her coffee, the pale November light strengthening outside her kitchen window. She wrote to herself at 23, at 35, when she'd wanted to go back to school and Gerald said it wasn't practical, at 47 when she'd felt invisible at parties while he charmed strangers, at 61 when she'd suggested marriage counseling and he'd said they were fine. Everything looked exactly as it had that morning, but the architecture of her interior world had collapsed. Ruth didn't sleep that night. She sat in Gerald's recliner, her recliner now, she supposed, and let rage move through her in waves. She thought about all the times she'd sensed something off, dismissed her own intuition as paranoia or insecurity. The weekend in 1987 when he'd been distant after a conference, and she'd blamed herself for not being interesting enough. The Christmas in the 90s when he'd seemed distracted during gift opening and she'd worked harder to make everything festive. How many moments had she gasped her own perceptions to preserve a fiction? By dawn, she'd moved from rage into something colder and more clarifying. She pulled out her old stationery, the cream-colored paper with small violets in the corner that she used for thank you notes, and began writing. Dear Diane. The letters started with measured fury. Ruth detailed exactly what Diane had participated in, the family dinners missed while Gerald was with her, the anniversaries half celebrated because he was emotionally elsewhere. By the end of that week, Ruth had written 47 letters. They sat in a cardboard box in her bedroom, a parallel archive to the affair letters still in Gerald's lockbox. She hadn't intended to keep writing, but each letter seemed to call forth the next, connecting dots she'd never allowed herself to connect while he was alive. Her daughter Sarah called on Friday to check in, the weekly ritual they'd maintained since the funeral. Ruth almost told her. The words gathered behind her teeth, "Your father betrayed me for 40 years," but something held them back. What would that revelation accomplish except transferring her pain to Sarah, forcing her to reconcile the father she'd loved with this new information? Ruth had already lost her husband. She wouldn't steal Sarah's father, too. But she needed to do something with the weight she was carrying. The idea arrived on a Sunday afternoon when Ruth was sorting through old photo albums. She'd been crying over a picture of their 20th anniversary. Gerald smiling, his arm around her, the restaurant they'd gone to in Columbus. The date on the back read June 15th, 1999. She checked the affair letters. Diane had written about their weekend in Cleveland that same month, overlapping within days. Ruth had spent that anniversary dinner believing she was cherished. The dissonance was crushing. She set the photo down and looked at the letters to her younger self. They weren't just therapeutic exercises anymore. They were testimony. Evidence that a woman could survive discovering her entire emotional foundation was compromised. Proof that you could be 76 years old, feel like you'd wasted your life, and still find solid ground beneath your feet. Someone else might need to hear that. Ruth had a friend, Margaret, who volunteered at a women's shelter downtown. They'd known each other since their kids were in elementary school, had survived PTA meetings and neighborhood drama together. Margaret had left her own marriage at 50 after years of what she carefully termed difficulty, and Ruth, who'd prided herself on making her own marriage work, had privately judged that decision as failure. The irony wasn't lost on her now. She called Margaret on Monday morning. They met for coffee at the diner near the shelter, the kind of place with bottomless cups and laminated menus advertising comfort food that tasted like nostalgia. Ruth brought the letters. "I need to show you something," Ruth said, pushing the box across the table between their plates of eggs and toast. "But I need you to promise you won't tell Sarah or my sons. I'm not ready for them to know." Margaret read without commenting, her coffee growing cold. When she finally looked up, her eyes held recognition rather than pity. "How long?" she asked. 43 years, apparently. I found out 2 weeks ago. He's been dead 3 months. "And you wrote these?" Margaret touched the letters to Ruth's younger self. "These are remarkable, Ruth. This wisdom. Women need to hear this." Ruth's first instinct was to minimize, to say it was just personal therapy, nothing important. But she caught herself performing that reflexive self-diminishment and stopped. "I thought maybe the shelter? If there are women there trying to figure out whether to leave or rebuilding after leaving, maybe it would help to know they're not alone." Margaret's smile was fierce. "When can you come talk to the residents?" Ruth expected to feel exposed, standing in the common room of the shelter 2 weeks later, facing a group of women whose ages ranged from 19 to 63. Some held children, some bore visible bruises. All wore the particular wariness of people who'd learned trust was dangerous. She dressed carefully that morning, her good slacks, a soft cardigan, pearl earrings Gerald had given her for their 30th anniversary. Then she took off the earrings. She didn't need to perform respectability for these women. They needed to see truth. "My name is Ruth. I'm 76 years old. 3 months ago, my husband died after 43 years of marriage. 2 months ago, I discovered he'd been unfaithful for most of those years. I didn't know, or maybe I did know, in the way we sometimes know things we can't afford to believe." The room smelled like industrial detergent and cheap coffee. Afternoon light slanted through high windows, catching dust motes. Someone's child whimpered, and a mother made soothing sounds. Ruth's hands trembled as she held her letters, the paper soft from repeated handling. "I spent 2 weeks furious. I wrote letters I planned to mail, to the other woman, to my children, to people at our church who'd praised our marriage. I wanted everyone to know what a lie it had been. Then I started writing letters to myself instead, to all the versions of me who didn't know how the story would turn out, who made choices based on incomplete information, who subordinated herself because that's what good women were supposed to do." She read excerpts. The room was silent except for her voice and the ambient sounds of the shelter, plumbing groaning, traffic outside, the low murmur of staff in other rooms. A woman in her 30s, holding a toddler, spoke first when Ruth finished. "How are you not more angry?" "I am angry. I'm furious. But I'm also 76. I've lived 3/4 of a century, and I get to decide what I do with however much time I have left. I can spend it prosecuting a dead man and the woman he betrayed me with, or I can spend it trying to make sure other women don't lose themselves the way I did." Another woman, younger, barely 20, "But didn't you waste your life? If you could go back, wouldn't you leave him?" Ruth considered this carefully. The answer mattered. "I don't know. I have 3 children I love, grandchildren, friendships built over decades in that neighborhood, a life that had real joy in it, even if the foundation was rotten. But what I do know is this: I should have been building my own foundation all along. Not leaving necessarily, but having the capability to leave, having my own money, my own skills, my own sense of who I was separate from being his wife." That's what these letters are about. Not telling anyone what to do, but documenting what I learned too late, that your value isn't contingent on someone else recognizing it, that you can be generous and accommodating without being self-erasing, that noticing when something's wrong isn't paranoia, it's data. The conversation continued for 90 minutes. Women asked questions Ruth had never considered. A 19-year-old wanted to know how you tell the difference between compromise and capitulation. A 47-year-old asked whether it was too late to start over. A 63-year-old, leaving her second marriage, needed to hear that it wasn't failure to try again and choose differently. Ruth didn't have all the answers, but she had her testimony, and sometimes testimony was enough. She started visiting the shelter weekly. The letters to her younger self evolved. She wrote new ones based on questions women asked, scenarios they described. She wrote about financial literacy, about recognizing manipulation, about the difference between privacy and secrecy in relationships. She wrote about red flags she'd ignored and green flags she'd taken for granted. She wrote about desire and sexuality at 76, about reinventing yourself when you thought all your chapters were written. Margaret suggested she compile them into something more structured. "These aren't just letters anymore, Ruth. This is a manual, a field guide for not losing yourself." Ruth resisted at first. Who was she to write a manual? She'd been the one deceived, the one who'd missed 40 years of betrayal happening under her own roof. But maybe that was exactly the point. Winter settled over Cleveland with the gray intensity that made spring feel like a rumor. Ruth worked on the manuscript in what was Gerald's office, surrounded by the boxes of belongings she still hadn't fully sorted. She'd considered clearing everything out, erasing his presence, but that felt like letting him determine her actions even in death. Instead, she made the space hers gradually, adding her books to his shelves, replacing his desk lamp with one she preferred, hanging art she liked on walls he'd kept bare. The writing was harder than the letters had been. A letter was conversational, intimate, aimed at one reader. A manuscript demanded structure, coherence, the kind of authority Ruth had spent her life believing she didn't possess. Her granddaughter Emma, Sarah's daughter, came to visit over Christmas break from her sophomore year at Northwestern. 20 years old, studying sociology, full of fierce opinions and dyed blue hair that Gerald would have disapproved of. Ruth found herself grateful he wasn't there to disapprove. They were making Christmas cookies on a Sunday afternoon, Ruth's annual tradition, the kitchen warm with sugar and cinnamon, NPR playing carols, when Emma noticed the manuscript pages scattered across the dining room table. "What's all that?" Emma asked, pressing thumbprints into peanut butter cookie dough. Ruth hesitated. Her children still didn't know about Gerald's affair. She'd protected them from that knowledge, letting them keep their father untarnished. But Emma wasn't a child, and Ruth was tired of protecting men who didn't deserve protection. "I'm writing something. Letters to my younger self. Advice I wish I'd had. I've been sharing them at a women's shelter downtown." Emma wiped flour from her hands and picked up a page. Ruth watched her granddaughter's expression shift as she read. Surprise giving way to recognition, then something fiercer. "Grandma," Emma said slowly, "this is about Grandpa, isn't it? Something happened." Ruth told her. Not everything. Some details weren't Emma's burden to carry, but enough. The affair, the discovery, the initial rage, the letters. Emma listened without interrupting, standing in Ruth's kitchen with cookie dough under her fingernails and tears tracking through the flour dust on her cheeks. "I don't know what to do with this," Emma said finally. "I loved him. He was Grandpa. He taught me to ride a bike. He came to all my softball games." "He was both," Ruth said. "People are both. That's the hardest thing I've learned. He loved you genuinely. He also betrayed me comprehensively. Both are true." "And you're not telling Mom?" "Not yet. Maybe not ever. What would it accomplish except hurt her? But I'm telling you because you're not responsible for his memory the way she is, and because I think you need to know this." Emma read more of the manuscript while cookies baked, filling the house with the smell of butter and vanilla. Ruth watched her granddaughter's face, seeing her process and integrate information that fundamentally revised her understanding of her family's foundation. Finally, Emma looked up. "This isn't just about Grandpa, is it? This is about all of it, how women are taught to shrink themselves, how we police each other into performing devotion, how we apologize for having needs." "Yes," Ruth said simply. "I need to tell you something," Emma said. "I've been seeing this guy, Jake. He's fine, nice enough, but I catch myself doing this thing where I'm always accommodating what he wants, suggesting restaurants I think he'll like, agreeing to watch movies I don't care about, making myself smaller so he feels bigger, and I hate it. I hate that I do it, but I can't seem to stop." Ruth felt something crack open in her chest. Here it was, the pattern repeating, the unconscious training being passed down despite their best intentions. Emma was 20, intelligent, feminist, progressive, and she was still performing the same self-erasure Ruth had perfected. "When I was your age," Ruth said, "I thought that's what love looked like, accommodation, making someone else's comfort your priority. It never occurred to me that real partnership meant both people accommodating, both people adjusting, both people considering." "But you stayed for 43 years. Even if you'd known, would you have left?" "I don't know," Ruth admitted, "but I would have had the option to leave. That's what I didn't have. Not really. No career, no independent income, no model for what life looked like outside that partnership. I made myself so dependent that leaving would have felt like amputating a limb." Emma was quiet for a long moment. "I'm going to break up with Jake." Ruth didn't tell her to do it or not do it. That wasn't her place. Instead, she said, "Whatever you decide, make sure you're capable of supporting yourself, financially, emotionally, practically, not because you should expect the worst, but because capability gives you choice, and choice gives you freedom." They finished the cookies together, the conversation shifting to lighter things, Emma's classes, her plans for spring break, her roommate drama. But something had shifted between them, a passing of knowledge that felt ceremonial despite the domestic setting. After Emma left, Ruth stood in her kitchen as evening darkened the windows. She thought about patterns and legacies, about the invisible curriculum that taught women to diminish themselves, about how trauma could become teaching. She went back to her manuscript with renewed purpose. The writing took 6 months. Ruth worked through winter into spring, through the 1-year anniversary of Gerald's death, through her 77th birthday. She wrote about recognizing emotional manipulation, about rebuilding self-trust after it's been compromised, about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. She wrote about sex and desire after betrayal, about mourning a relationship while being angry at it simultaneously, about the specific grief of realizing you didn't know someone you shared a bed with for decades. She included the original letters to her younger self, but expanded far beyond them. She interviewed other women at the shelter, with their permission, compiling their wisdom alongside her own. The manuscript became a chorus of voices, different experiences unified by common themes. Margaret connected her with a small press that specialized in women's narratives. The editor, a woman in her 50s, read the manuscript over the weekend and called Monday morning. "This is important," the editor said, "raw and honest in a way that's rare. We'd like to publish it." The book came out the following spring, 2 years after Gerald's death. Ruth insisted on a simple cover, cream-colored like her stationery, with the title in her own handwriting, "The Letters I Should Have Written, Finding Yourself After Losing Your Way." The launch event was at a small independent bookstore in Cleveland Heights, the kind of place with creaking wooden floors and a cat that wandered between shelves. Ruth hadn't expected many people, maybe Margaret, Emma, a few women from the shelter, but the space filled, 40, 50 women, ranging from their 20s to their 80s. Some brought their daughters, some came alone, clutching the anonymity of the crowd. Ruth stood at the small podium with its adjustable microphone and looked out at these faces. She'd spent 77 years trying to make herself acceptable, inoffensive, easy to love. She'd subordinated her voice to Gerald's, to her children's needs, to the social scripts that told women their value lay in service and accommodation. "Thank you for coming," she began. "This book is about making a catastrophic discovery at 76 and realizing you have two choices: let it define your ending or use it as a strange, painful beginning." She read excerpts. The room was silent except for her voice and the occasional sound of pages turning as people followed along in their purchased copies, underlining passages, making margin notes. She read the letter to her 47-year-old self about wanting more from life than domestic competence. She read the letter about recognizing when compromise becomes self-abandonment. She read about rebuilding identity after you've defined yourself primarily as someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's appendage rather than your own complete person. When she finished, the questions came rapid fire. How do you trust again? How do you forgive yourself for not seeing what was happening? How do you explain to your children that you're dismantling the family mythology they've built their identities around? How do you start over when you're 60, 70, 80, when society says your story is supposed to be finished? Ruth answered with the hard-won knowledge of someone who'd done the work, who was still doing it. She didn't pretend to have all the answers. She acknowledged the complexities, the contradictions, the ways healing wasn't linear or neat. A woman in her 30s approached after the formal Q&A ended while Ruth was signing books. "My mother needs this," she said, setting 3 copies on the table. "She's been married 42 years. I think he's cheating. She won't talk about it. She just keeps making excuses. How do I—" "You can't make her see it," Ruth said gently, signing the books. "Denial is protective until it isn't, but you can make sure she knows there are women who survived the discovery, who found solid ground after the foundation crumbled. Give her the book, let her know you'll be there for her, and then let her come to it in her own time." The woman's eyes filled. "Is that what you'd tell your younger self, to leave?" "No," Ruth said. "I'd tell her to build her own foundation, to be capable of leaving, whether or not she ever does. That capability is everything." The book found its audience slowly, the way meaningful things often do. It started at shelters, passed woman to woman, then book clubs, then therapists began recommending it to clients navigating relationships. Then it spread wider, reviewed in outlets that covered women's issues, discussed on podcasts about resilience and reinvention. Ruth was invited to speak at more events, libraries, community centers, universities. Each time the rooms filled with women hungry for permission to name their experiences, to trust their perceptions, to prioritize their own flourishing alongside their relationships. She spoke at a women's prison once, invited by a rehabilitation program. Those women understood betrayal in visceral ways, by partners, by systems, by their own choices that had seemed necessary at the time. They asked the hardest questions, demanded the most honest answers. Ruth left that session shaken and strangely energized, reminded that wisdom wasn't about avoiding mistakes, but about mining them for usable truth. Emma came to many of the talks, sitting in back rows, watching her grandmother claim authority and space in a way she'd never seen growing up. Afterward, during the drive home, she'd ask questions. "Did you love him?" Emma asked one evening, navigating Cleveland traffic. Actually love him, or was it just habit and obligation? Ruth considered this carefully. Both. I loved him, and I loved the idea of him, and I loved the life we built, but I'm not sure I knew him well enough to love the real person. He didn't let me, or I didn't demand to. It's hard to separate out what was his withholding and what my acceptance of scraps. That's so sad, Grandma. It is, but it's also common. That's what I'm learning. How many women have versions of this story? The specifics differ, but the architecture is similar. We're taught to interpret our needs as selfishness, to read our perceptions as paranoia, to prioritize peace over truth. 3 years after Gerald's death, Ruth received an email that stopped her cold. The subject line read, "From Diane." Her first instinct was to delete it unread, but curiosity, or maybe something more complex, made her open it. "Dear Ruth, I know you must hate me. I hate myself. I'm writing because I'm dying, stage 4 pancreatic cancer, maybe 6 months left, and I need to say things I should have said decades ago. I knew he was married. I knew about you. I told myself stories that made it acceptable, that you didn't understand him, that your marriage was dead already, that I was providing something you couldn't. I was lying to myself. I was lying to you, even though we never met. He wasn't what I told myself he was. He wasn't trapped in a loveless marriage. He was someone who wanted 2 lives and chose both of them at your expense and mine. I didn't see that clearly until near the end, when he started pulling away. I think he was getting scared someone would find out. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not writing to ask for that. I'm writing because I'm leaving money to a foundation that supports women recovering from abusive relationships, and I wanted you to know, because you were in one, even if he never hit you. Economic abuse, emotional abuse, keeping you dependent while he maintained an entirely separate relationship. That's abuse. I participated in it. I'm sorry doesn't cover it, but I am. I'm sorry. Ruth read the email 3 times. Each time, different emotions surfaced. Fury that Diane thought a deathbed confession and charitable donation could somehow balance the scales. Relief that Diane knew that Ruth wasn't crazy for feeling the marriage had been abusive even without physical violence. Sorrow for 2 women who'd loved a man who'd treated them both as supporting characters in his story, not full human beings worthy of honesty. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she saved the email and sat with it. She walked through her neighborhood in the late afternoon, watching sprinklers cast rainbows across lawns, thinking about forgiveness and accountability, and how they weren't always the same thing. That evening, she opened her laptop and wrote back, "Diane, thank you for writing. I won't pretend this absolves anything, but I appreciate your honesty now, belated as it is. I've spent 3 years reconstructing my understanding of my marriage, and your email adds pieces I didn't have. You're right, it was abusive, though I didn't have language for that at the time. I blamed myself for not being enough. Now I understand that enough was never achievable, because the problem wasn't my deficiency, it was his choice to lie. I hope your last months are peaceful. I hope you found whatever peace is available. I don't forgive you. I'm not sure forgiveness is mine to give for choices you made about your own life, but I don't hate you either. Mostly, I feel sad for both of us, for the years we spent orbiting someone who saw us as supporting characters in his story, not full human beings. Ruth." 6 months later, Margaret forwarded Ruth an obituary. Diane had died. The notice mentioned her career, a successful real estate agent, her nieces and nephews, and the foundation she'd endowed for supporting women leaving abusive relationships. The foundation was named after her mother. Ruth read the obituary sitting in her kitchen, morning light streaming through windows she'd recently had cleaned. She thought about Diane's life, the pieces she'd glimpsed through letters and the final email. Another woman who'd made compromises, different ones but from similar training, that women's needs were negotiable, that their lives could be scheduled around men's availability, that love meant accepting scraps and calling them feasts. She added a section to her manuscript's second edition, which her publisher had requested given the book's unexpected success. The new section was about the other woman, not villainizing her, but examining how the same cultural programming that kept wives accommodating kept mistresses accepting secrecy, different manifestations of the same central problem. Women taught that their value was contingent on male attention and approval. The book's success meant Ruth's financial situation improved. The advance and royalties weren't enormous, this wasn't commercial fiction, but they were steady. For the first time in her adult life, she had independent income, money she earned through her own work, her own voice, her own testimony. She opened her own bank account, not leaving their joint accounts exactly, though Gerald's name had been removed after his death, but creating something separate. She hired a financial advisor, a woman recommended by Margaret, and learned about investments and retirement planning in ways she'd never engaged with when Gerald managed her money. "You're 79, the advisor said during their first meeting. "Most people your age are worried about managing what they have. You're talking about building wealth." "I'm talking about not being dependent, ever again, even on my children if I need care eventually. I want resources. I want options." The advisor smiled. "Then let's build you some options." Emma graduated from Northwestern and moved to Chicago, working for a nonprofit that provided legal services to low-income women. She'd shifted her career plans after watching Ruth's transformation, after reading the manuscript, after those conversations over Christmas cookies that had revealed fault lines in their family foundation. They talked weekly, long phone calls where Emma processed cases that haunted her, and Ruth provided the perspective of someone who'd lived through what her clients were surviving. "I had a client today," Emma said one evening, 53 years old, 3 kids, married 30 years, found out her husband had a second family in another state, another wife, 2 more kids. He'd been living 2 entire lives. Ruth thought about Diane's email, about the architecture of deception required to maintain separate realities. What did she need? Everything. Housing, legal representation, therapy, job placement. She hasn't worked in 25 years. She kept apologizing, saying she should have known, she should have been smarter. "I wanted to give her your book." "Give her my number if she wants to talk to someone who gets it." The woman called 2 weeks later. Her name was Patricia. They talked for 90 minutes, Ruth listening mostly, offering observations when asked, but primarily providing the service of witnessing, letting Patricia speak her disbelief, her rage, her embarrassment, her terror about the future. "Everyone says I should have known," Patricia said. "My own sister said I must have been in denial. But I wasn't. I truly didn't know. Does that make me stupid?" "No," Ruth said firmly. "It makes you someone who trusted, someone who believed the evidence of your daily experience. He was there for dinners, for holidays, for your mother's funeral. How were you supposed to know he was also somewhere else being someone else? The problem isn't your perception, it's his deception." Patricia was quiet for a long moment. "How did you survive it, the discovery?" "I'm still surviving it," Ruth said honestly. "It's not past tense. but I decided that he didn't get to write the ending of my story. That's been the work, taking back authorship. Patricia became one of many women Ruth connected with through Emma's nonprofit and through the book's expanding reach. She started facilitating a monthly support group at the shelter where she'd first shared her letters 5 years earlier. 6 to 12 women would gather, ages and circumstances varying, unified by the experience of discovering their relationships were not what they'd believed. Ruth brought structure, but held it loosely. Sometimes they processed specific incidents. Sometimes they discussed practical survival, how to rebuild credit, how to explain employment gaps, how to co-parent with someone you no longer trust. Sometimes they just sat together in the silence of shared experience, drinking terrible shelter coffee and existing in their grief without having to explain it or justify it. During one meeting, a woman in her 60s named Carol asked the question that always lingered beneath the surface. Does it get better, really better, or just different bad? Ruth considered this carefully. The room waited. She'd learned that these women needed honesty more than reassurance. Both, she said finally. It gets different, and whether different is better depends on what you build with the space grief creates. I won't lie, there are still days I'm furious, days I look at our old photos and feel like I'm looking at a stranger, days I wonder what my life would have been if I'd known at 30, at 40, at 50. But there are also days I feel more fully myself than I ever did in 60 years of trying to be what someone else needed. Do you date? Another woman asked. I can't imagine ever trusting anyone again. No, Ruth admitted, but that's partly age, partly exhaustion, partly not wanting to navigate that terrain again. But I have friendships that sustain me, work that matters to me, autonomy I never had. That's enough. Sarah, Ruth's daughter, finally learned about Gerald's affair in a way Ruth hadn't planned. She'd found the first edition of Ruth's book at her book club. One of the other members had brought it, and recognized details that were too specific to be fictional. She'd called Ruth immediately, crying, "Mom, the book! That's you! That's Dad! Why didn't you tell me?" They'd met for lunch, a quiet place downtown where they could talk without being overheard. Ruth explained gently, carefully, watching Sarah's face as she processed information that rewrote her understanding of her parents' marriage. "I thought you were happy," Sarah said finally. "All those years, I thought we were this functional family. Was any of it real?" "Yes," Ruth said firmly. "Your childhood was real. The vacations were real. Your father's love for you was real. People are complicated, Sarah. He was a good father and a dishonest husband. Both are true." She struggled with it. Ruth watched her daughter work through anger at Gerald, at Ruth for not telling her, at herself for not seeing signs. They had difficult conversations over months. Sarah was in therapy, processing childhood memories through this new lens, discovering moments that now had different meanings. "When I was 16, Sarah said during one of their lunches, I came home from a date upset because the boy had lied about something minor, and Dad gave me this whole talk about integrity and honesty in relationships, about how real love required truth. And he looked me right in the eye and said that, while he'd been lying to you for almost 20 years at that point." "Yes," Ruth said simply. "How do you live with that? The hypocrisy?" "I live with it because he's dead and I'm not, because I get to decide what I do with the information now, because anger is valid, but being consumed by it doesn't hurt him, it only hurts me." As Ruth moved into her 80s, the work with the book and the support groups became her primary identity. Not grandmother, not widow, not retired librarian, but someone who'd transformed private devastation into public testimony, who'd taken the worst discovery of her life and made it mean something beyond her own pain. She was invited to speak at universities, at conferences on domestic abuse, at training sessions for therapists working with older adults. She became, improbably, a minor expert on betrayal trauma and identity reconstruction in later life. The attention was sometimes uncomfortable. Ruth had spent 80 years being private, accommodating, quiet. Claiming space in public forums required rewiring she had to choose daily. But the feedback she received, emails from women who'd read her book, messages from people attending her talks, made the uncomfort worthwhile. One email stayed with her. A woman wrote, "I'm 25. I read your book after my mom gave it to me. I'm not married, never been betrayed in the way you were, but reading about how you learned to advocate for yourself has changed how I approach my relationship. I negotiate now. I state my needs. I check in with myself about whether I'm shrinking to accommodate. Your 76-year-old self is teaching my 25-year-old self things I should have learned a decade ago. Thank you." Ruth saved that email in a special folder. Evidence that the work mattered, that testimony could travel across generations, preventing damage before it calcified into life patterns. Emma visited for Ruth's 81st birthday, bringing flowers and Ruth's favorite lemon cake from the bakery near the house. They sat in Ruth's kitchen, the same kitchen where they'd made Christmas cookies years ago, where Ruth had first told Gerald of his betrayal, where so many of Ruth's pivotal moments had occurred. "I've been thinking," Emma said, serving cake onto the good china plates Ruth rarely used, "about what you said years ago, about capability and choice, about how you wished you'd been able to support yourself." "I remember. I make enough money now to be fully independent. I have my own apartment, my own savings, my own career, and I'm dating someone, Mara from the nonprofit. It's serious, but I'm not compromising myself this time. I'm negotiating. We're building something where both of us get to be complete people." Ruth felt her eyes fill. "That's what I wanted. For you, for all the women who come after. Not perfection, just the ability to choose from a position of strength rather than dependency." "You did that," Emma said gently. "You took the worst thing and made it into this legacy. These women you've helped, the conversations you've changed. That's impact, Grandma. That's using pain for something beyond revenge." Ruth thought about the letter she'd written 6 years ago, sitting in this same kitchen, rage bleeding through her handwriting onto cream-colored stationery. She thought about the choice she'd made, not to mail the fury, but to transform it, not to prosecute the dead, but to illuminate paths for the living. "I still get angry," Ruth admitted. "There are still days I want to scream at him, at her, at the unfairness of it all. But then I get emails from women who've read the book, or I sit with the group at the shelter and watch someone realize they're not crazy, their perceptions are valid. And it feels like taking poison and making medicine. Not perfect medicine, but something that helps." Emma reached across the table and took Ruth's hand. "You've helped me, too, maybe most of all. Watching you rebuild, it taught me that life isn't over when your foundation cracks. Sometimes the crack lets light in." That night after Emma left, Ruth sat in her living room as darkness settled over the neighborhood. The house was quiet except for familiar sounds, the furnace clicking on, branches scraping against gutters, distant traffic, the same sounds that had formed the backdrop of her married life, but they meant something different now. She pulled out her journal, not the letters to her younger self, but a regular journal where she tracked her current life, her ongoing becoming. She wrote about the birthday, about Emma's visit, about the strange gift of having lived long enough to see transformation complete its arc. "I'm 81, she wrote. "Gerald has been dead 7 years. Diane has been dead 4. The affair lasted 43 years, and I've spent 7 years processing it, using it, making it into something beyond what was done to me. The math is strange. More than 60 decades together, less than a decade rebuilding, and yet these 7 years feel more substantial than all those earlier ones, as if I was only partly real then and fully real now." Ruth continued to facilitate the Wednesday night group, continued to speak when invited, continued to write. She'd started working on a second book, this one focused specifically on financial literacy and independence for women of all ages. She interviewed financial advisors, lawyers, women who'd rebuilt from economic devastation. She wanted to give practical tools alongside the emotional testimony. The work kept her sharp, kept her engaged. She adopted a cat from the shelter, a grumpy orange tabby named Franklin, who'd been returned twice for being too independent. Ruth appreciated the irony. She and Franklin coexisted comfortably, two beings who'd learned they were complete on their own. Her sons, who'd struggled more than Sarah with the revelations about their father, gradually came to terms with the complexity. They'd visit, bringing grandchildren, and they'd talk honestly about Gerald in ways they never had when he was alive, acknowledging his flaws alongside his love for them, making space for contradiction. One Wednesday evening, 5 years after Gerald's death and 3 years after the book's publication, a new woman joined the support group. She was in her late 70s, well-dressed, visibly uncomfortable in the shelter's institutional setting. She sat through most of the meeting quietly, listening as others shared. Near the end, she spoke. "I've been married 56 years. I discovered the affair 3 weeks ago. He's in hospice now, cancer. Everyone expects me to sit by his bedside, being the devoted wife, and I don't know if I can do it. Does that make me terrible?" The room was silent. Ruth recognized something in this woman's face, the specific devastation of late-life betrayal, of realizing you'd given your entire adult existence to a fiction. "No," Ruth said gently, "it makes you honest. You don't owe performance to someone who betrayed you, not even at the end." "But everyone says." "I know what everyone says. Everyone said I should protect my children from the truth about their father. Everyone said I should be grateful for the good years. Everyone said worse things could have happened. But here's what I learned. Other people's expectations don't have to determine your reality. You get to decide what you can live with." The woman, her name was Virginia, began crying. Not quiet tears, but deep sobs that seemed to come from her sternum. The group sat with her, offering tissues and presents, but not trying to fix or minimize. This was the work, witnessing each other's pain without rushing toward resolution. After the meeting, Virginia approached Ruth. "I bought your book last week. I've read it 3 times. It's the only thing that's made sense." "I'm glad. I wish I didn't have to have written it, but I'm glad it helps." "How do you not hate men? How do you not become bitter?" Ruth considered this carefully. It was a question she'd wrestled with for years. "I hate what was done to me. I'm angry at the systems that taught both of us our roles. But hatred of all men, that would just be another cage. I've spent enough of my life in cages." Virginia became a regular at the group, bringing perspective from her generation. Women who'd come to age in the 1940s and 50s, when expectations for wives were even more rigid. She and Ruth developed a friendship, trading observations about surviving betrayal at an age when society suggested their lives were essentially over. "We're supposed to be winding down," Virginia said once, sitting in Ruth's kitchen, that kitchen that had witnessed so many pivotal conversations. Planning funerals, giving away belongings, preparing for the end. Instead, we're starting over. It's absurd. "It's hopeful," Ruth countered. "It means it's never too late to choose yourself, even at 77, 81, 85, whatever age. Even at the end, you can rewrite the story you tell about your life." "Is that what you're doing? Rewriting?" "Yes. The marriage wasn't what I thought it was, but my life isn't just the marriage. I'm excavating all the other parts, the friendships, the work I did at the library, the children I raised, the garden I tended, the books I read. Gerald was part of the story, but he wasn't the whole story. I'm learning to read my life differently." Ruth's 82nd birthday arrived quietly. She spent it with Emma and Mara, with her sons and their families, with Margaret and Virginia, and a few women from the support group who'd become friends. They gathered in Ruth's backyard, the garden she'd expanded and redesigned, adding vegetables and herbs alongside the roses Gerald had planted decades ago. The roses remained. Ruth had considered tearing them out the first year after the discovery, symbolic violence against his memory. But the roses hadn't betrayed her. They were just plants, growing where they'd been placed. She'd kept them and added her own plantings around them, transforming the space into something that held both history and her own design. The party was informal, potluck dishes, folding chairs on the grass, conversation flowing easily. Emma gave a speech, talking about watching her grandmother transform grief into action, devastation into testimony. "You taught me that resilience isn't about not being broken, it's what you build with the pieces." Late in the afternoon, after most guests had left, Ruth sat in her garden with Margaret, watching evening light turn everything golden. The air smelled like roses and fresh-cut grass, like summer in Cleveland, like life continuing despite everything. "Are you happy?" Margaret asked. "Actually happy, not just okay." Ruth thought about this honestly. Happiness felt like a complicated word, too simple for what she was experiencing. "I'm at peace," she said finally, "which might be better than happy. I'm not at war with my past anymore. I'm not consumed by what he did or what I didn't see. I'm just here, fully here, in a way I wasn't for most of my life." "That's what I wanted for you," Margaret said. "When you first told me, when you showed me those letters, I didn't know if you'd make it through. The devastation was so complete." "I didn't know either, but I had a choice. Let it destroy me or let it teach me, and teaching seemed more useful." The second book came out when Ruth was 83, Building Your Own Foundation, Financial Independence at Any Age. Was more practical than the first, less memoir and more manual. It covered everything Ruth had learned about money, independence, and capability, information she wished someone had taught her at 25, at 40, at 60. The launch event was bigger than the first books had been. Ruth's profile had grown. The first book had reached enough women that the second drew immediate attention. The bookstore, a different one, larger in downtown Cleveland, was packed, standing room only, women with notebooks and questions and stories they needed to share. Ruth stood at the podium, looking out at faces that ranged from early 20s to late 80s, different generations, different circumstances, unified by the understanding that financial independence wasn't about greed, it was about freedom. "My husband managed our money for 43 years, Ruth began. "I didn't know what we had, what we owed, how any of it worked. When he died, I discovered the affair and also discovered I had no idea how to function financially without him. That ignorance was part of the control structure, even if we neither of us recognized it that way. This book is about making sure you never find yourself in that position. A young woman in her 20s raised her hand during Q&A. I'm not married. I'm not even seriously dating anyone, but my mom made me read your first book, and now this one. She says I need to prepare for the possibility of betrayal. That feels cynical. Should I really start every relationship assuming it might end badly? Ruth considered how to answer this carefully. The room waited. Not cynically, she said. Realistically. You wear a seatbelt not because you expect to crash, but because you're acknowledging possibility. Building your own foundation, financial, emotional, practical, isn't preparing for failure. It's ensuring that if your relationship ends, for any reason, you have ground to stand on. It makes you a better partner, actually, because you're choosing to stay rather than being trapped into staying. The room murmured agreement. Someone called out, I wish my mother had heard this 50 years ago. I wish I'd heard it 70 years ago, Ruth said. But I'm hearing it now, and that's what matters. It's never too late to start building. The work continued. Ruth spoke and wrote and facilitated and listened. She watched women arrive at the shelter broken and leave months later with plans and possibilities. She watched Emma build a partnership with Mara that looked nothing like Ruth's marriage, mutual, negotiated, with both women maintaining separate identities alongside their shared life. She watched her sons examine their own relationships, having difficult conversations with their wives about equality and independence. She watched the ripples extend outward from the stone of her testimony. On her 85th birthday, Ruth received an unexpected package. Inside was a letter and a check for $30,000. The letter read, Dear Ruth, I'm the daughter of Diane, the woman who had the affair with your husband. My mother died 6 years ago. Before she died, she told me about the affair, about your husband, about the foundation she'd endowed. She also told me about you, about the book you'd written, about how you'd responded to discovery, not with revenge, but with teaching. I've read both your books. I wanted to send this money to support your work at the shelter, to the support groups you run. My mother did harm. I can't undo that. But maybe this can help fund what you're building from what she helped break. With respect, Catherine. Ruth sat with the check for a long time. $30,000, enough to fund the support groups for years, to provide resources for women leaving dangerous situations, to expand the work in ways she'd only imagined. She could refuse it, send it back on principle, reject money connected to the affair. That would be one kind of integrity. Or she could accept it, take the money, use it, transform it into something that helped others, turn the currency of betrayal into the currency of liberation. She deposited the check, used it to create a fund specifically for helping older women, those over 65, rebuild after betrayal or abuse, the demographic most often overlooked, most likely to be told their lives were essentially finished, that starting over was impossible. Ruth named the fund the Second Foundation Fund, because it was never too late to build again. Years accumulated. Ruth moved from 85 to 87 to 89. She slowed physically, but remained sharp, still facilitating the Wednesday group, still writing occasional essays about resilience and reconstruction. The books continued to sell steadily, finding new readers, being passed from mothers to daughters, from therapists to clients, from one survivor to another. Emma and Mara got married in a small ceremony in Ruth's backyard garden, under the roses that had witnessed so much. Ruth officiated, her voice strong as she spoke about partnership that honored wholeness rather than requiring diminishment.
She looked at her granddaughter, confident, capable, building a relationship as equals, and felt the specific satisfaction of knowing patterns could break, that damage didn't have to travel down generations unchanged. Sarah reconciled with her father's memory in her own way, telling her own children about their grandfather honestly, his love and his flaws, his generosity and his betrayal. She'd learned from Ruth that truth-telling, even painful truth-telling, was a gift. On her 90th birthday, Ruth sat in her living room surrounded by people who loved her. Not because she'd made herself small enough to be lovable, not because she'd performed devotion or accommodation, but because she was fully herself, complicated, honest, resilient, still becoming. The house was full of voices, laughter, the chaos of multiple conversations happening simultaneously. Through the window, she could see her garden in full summer bloom, roses and vegetables and herbs, planned chaos, beauty and utility coexisting. Emma found her in a quiet moment, brought her tea. "How does it feel, 90? "Surprising," Ruth admitted. "I didn't think I'd make it here. Not the dying part, I've always been healthy, but the surviving part. After Gerald died, after I found the letters, I thought my life was essentially over, that I'd just be managing decline, processing grief until the end. I didn't imagine this." She gestured to the room, the people, the full life humming around her. "You built it," Emma said. "You didn't let the betrayal be the end of your story. You made it a middle chapter, a turning point." Ruth thought about that framing. A turning point. Not an ending, not even the climax, just a moment when the narrative pivoted, when she'd had to decide who she was beyond the roles she'd inhabited for 70 decades. "I wrote all those letters to my younger self, giving advice I thought I needed then. But maybe the real lesson isn't in the specific advice. Maybe it's just this: you're allowed to rewrite. At any point, at any age, you're allowed to look at the story you've been telling about your life and say, actually, that's not quite right. Let me try again." Is that what you did? Rewrite? Yes, and the new version is more honest, even if it's more painful, because it includes all of me, not just the parts that were convenient or acceptable. The angry parts, the disappointed parts, the parts that wanted more than I was willing to admit wanting. The new story is bigger. There's room in it for me to be complicated. The party continued around them. Eventually, Ruth rejoined it, moving through conversations, accepting embraces and birthday wishes. She was 90 years old. She'd lived through a depression and multiple wars, through technological revolutions and social transformations. She'd raised children, built a career, survived widowhood and betrayal, and the complete reconstruction of her own understanding of her own life. And she was still here, still learning, still helping, still becoming. That night, after everyone left, Ruth sat in her garden as stars emerged above Cleveland. The air was warm, cicadas singing their evening chorus. She thought about the lockbox she'd found 14 years ago, about opening it, feeling like the end of everything. She thought about the letters she'd written in fury and then in wisdom, about the book that emerged from those letters, the second book that followed, the support groups and speaking engagements and conversations with hundreds of women trying to find their own solid ground. She thought about Gerald, dead now for 14 years. She'd made peace with him in the sense that she no longer needed him to have been different. He'd been who he was, someone capable of love and deception simultaneously, someone who'd given her real joy while simultaneously betraying her trust. The contradiction didn't need resolution, it just needed acknowledgement.
She thought about Diane, who'd lived her own complicated story, made her own compromises, died with her own regrets. Ruth didn't forgive her exactly, but she'd stopped needing to maintain the boundary of unforgiveness. They'd both been in relationship with the same man, both seen partial versions of him, both believed they understood the whole. Mostly, Ruth thought about the women she'd met through the work, the hundreds of faces in support groups at book events and emails and letters, women reconstructing themselves after devastation, women choosing to build rather than destroy, to teach rather than punish, to transform pain into something useful for others. One question kept circulating through Ruth's mind on this milestone birthday. Would she go back and change it? If she could rewind to 1967, to that moment in her parents' living room when she was about to marry Gerald, if she could whisper in her younger self's ear about what was coming, would she? The answer was more complicated than yes or no. She wouldn't want to experience the betrayal again. The discovery was genuinely devastating, a psychological rupture that had taken years to metabolize. But the person she'd become in processing that devastation, the wisdom she'd gained, the clarity she'd found, the work she was doing, the woman she'd become at 90, that person only existed because of the breaking. You couldn't have the reconstruction without the destruction. You couldn't have the wisdom without the wound. Ruth stood slowly, her knees protesting but manageable, and walked through her garden. She touched the roses Gerald had planted, the herbs she'd added, the vegetables she grew each year. Past and present, his contribution and hers, growing together in soil that didn't distinguish between them. She thought about the title of her first book, The Letters I Should Have Written, but maybe should have was the wrong frame. Maybe they were exactly the letters she needed to write at exactly the age she needed to write them after exactly the experiences required to give them weight. Maybe there was no should have. Maybe there was only what happened and what you chose to build with what happened. Ruth went inside, made chamomile tea, sat at her kitchen table with her journal. 90 years old, still processing, still questioning, still learning. She wrote, "Today I am 90. Gerald has been dead 14 years. I've lived more of my life with him gone than I lived discovering his betrayal and rebuilding from it. The marriage was 60 years. The grief and reconstruction was 14. And somehow these 14 years feel as substantial as all those 60, as if I was practicing being myself then and finally performing it now." Ruth closed her journal and sat in the quiet of her kitchen. The house settled around her, familiar and solid. Outside, the neighborhood slept. Houses full of people living their own complicated stories, carrying their own secrets and griefs and quiet triumphs. She thought about all the women she'd helped, all the conversations she'd facilitated, all the letters she'd written, not changing the past, but changing how the past damage traveled forward, interrupting patterns, offering different possibilities. That was the work, not revenge, not even justice exactly, but transformation, taking the currency of harm and using it to fund something better. She thought about the title for a potential third book she'd been considering, Starting at the End, Building Life from Unexpected Beginnings, because that's what she'd done at 76. Started over when she was supposed to be finished, built when she was supposed to be declining. And the building had been worth it. Ruth finished her tea and looked around her kitchen, evidence of life lived, dishes in the drainer, mail on the counter, Franklin's food bowl on the floor, the calendar with Wednesday's support group circled, notes for the essay she was writing about resilience and autonomy. All of it,
The grief and the rebuilding, the letters and the books, the support groups and the conversations, the rage and the peace, all of it was hers, not defined by what Gerald had done to her, but by what she chose to do with what he'd done to her. That was the lesson she wanted to leave. You don't control what happens to you. You don't control who betrays you, who lies, who fails you. But you control the next chapter. You control whether betrayal becomes your ending or your turning point. You control whether you disappear into the harm done to you or whether you use it as unexpected building material for something you couldn't have imagined before the breaking. Ruth thought about that first afternoon when she'd opened the lockbox, when her hands had trembled and her world had collapsed. She was 76, newly widowed, wearing Gerald's sweatshirt, believing she knew the story of her life. She thought about the woman she'd been then, devastated, furious, shattered. If that version of herself could see this version, 90 years old, peaceful, surrounded by evidence of impact and meaning, what would she think? Maybe she'd be surprised. Maybe she'd be grateful. Maybe she'd understand that survival wasn't passive, it was a series of active choices to keep becoming, keep building, keep transforming. Ruth stood slowly, her knees protesting but manageable, and climbed the stairs to bed. Moving slowly, gripping the railing, Ruth thought about legacy, not the legacy Gerald had left, complicated, tarnished, dual, but the legacy she was building now. Books that helped women recognize their worth, support groups that witnessed pain without minimizing it, essays and talks that gave permission for reconstruction at any age. Emma building a partnership of equals, countless women she'd never met making different choices because they'd read her testimony.
That was legacy. Not perfection, not avoiding pain, but using pain to illuminate paths for others. Taking the worst thing that happened to you and refusing to let it be only destruction, insisting it could also be catalyst, teaching, foundation for something better. Ruth reached her bedroom, changed into pajamas, and settled into bed. Franklin jumped up and curled against her side, purring. Through the window, she could see stars above Cleveland, the same stars that had witnessed her marriage, her widowhood, her discovery, her rebuilding. The same stars, but she was different underneath them. 90 years old, still here, still becoming. As sleep approached, Ruth thought one more time about the letters she'd written, the ones that started everything. "Dear Ruth," they'd begun, "I'm writing from your future to tell you something nobody told us then." But maybe the most important letter was the one she could write now, from 90 looking back at 76, from peace looking back at devastation. "Dear Ruth, you just found the lockbox. Your hands are shaking. Your world is collapsing. You think your life is over, that you wasted 60 years, that there's nothing left but managing decline and processing grief until death. I'm writing from 14 years in your future to tell you something you can't believe yet. This is not your ending. This is your turning point. What you build from here, the books, the groups, the women you'll help, the legacy you'll create, it will be more substantial than anything you built in those 60 years of trying to be enough for someone who was never looking for enough. The betrayal is real, the grief is real, the rage is real. Feel it all, but then, and this is crucial, transform it. Don't let him determine your ending. Write your own. You have 14 years ahead of you, maybe more, and they will be the most fully yourself years you've ever lived. You will help hundreds of women find solid ground. You will teach Emma to build differently. You will create something lasting from the worst thing that ever happened to you. This is not your end, 76-year-old Ruth. This is your beginning.
with love and hard-won wisdom, 90-year-old Ruth. And then Ruth slept, peaceful in her Cleveland home, Franklin purring beside her, garden growing outside her window, evidence of her rebuilt life surrounding her like grace. The lockbox that had held Gerald's secrets sat somewhere in her attic now, packed away alongside other artifacts of her former life. She'd kept it, but it didn't define her anymore. It was just evidence of what she'd survived, what she'd transformed, what she'd refused to let destroy her. In the morning, she'd wake up 90 years old. She'd make coffee, feed the cat, maybe work in the garden before the day grew hot. She'd continue the work of helping women choose themselves, of interrupting damage before it calcified into generations, of testifying that resilience wasn't about avoiding breaking, it was about what you built with the pieces. But tonight, she slept. Peaceful, complete. 90 years into a life that surprised her with its capacity for transformation, its refusal to end when she thought it was over, its insistence that beginning again was always possible, even, especially, at the end. The letters Ruth never sent became the legacy she chose instead. Not revenge, not bitterness, but wisdom passed forward, breaking patterns, teaching women their worth wasn't contingent on someone else's recognition. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal isn't destroying what broke you, it's using the breaking to build something unbreakable in others. What would you write to your younger self? What wisdom would you pass forward? The purpose of our channel is to create a positive change through our stories. If you like our cause and our stories, please subscribe to our channel for more stories.